Actually, we are at the end of the chapter in which Sri Aurobindo comments on the second part of the Kena Upanishad. And we have seen here that it is possible, with the limited capacity that we have of our thoughts, of our mind's ability to know, to reach out to something which is as if an idealized or higher, refined perception of our mind, by which we can approach the Brahman and know him in the way that he reveals himself to our mentality. That becomes the link point. The Brahman leaning down into manifestation, our mind rising up to the limits of what it can know, and the two entering in a point of contact. At that point, he says, we can know. The Kena Upanishad declares, I think not that I know it well, and yet I know that it is not unknown to me. He of us who knows it, knows that. He knows that it is not unknown to him. But then comes the verse number 4 in this part, which we have read last time and also read briefly Sri Aurobindo's translation and explanation, but which we need to dwell upon for the deeper sense that it conveys. It's somewhat cryptic, and Sri Aurobindo's explanation also compresses a large content into a brief formulation. And the verse 4 goes thus: when it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. By the self, one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge, one finds immortality. So in commenting on this verse, Sri Aurobindo explains, the mind can only reflect in a sort of supreme understanding and experience the form, the image of the Supreme as He shows Himself to our mentality. Through this reflection, we know the purpose of knowledge is accomplished, for we find immortality. We enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. So far, what he describes is in a continuation of the previous discussion. And there is a point where we receive as if in a reflection. Because remember, what we seek to know is beyond form, is unknowable by form. And mind is only a means of knowing in form and by form. And so how far can it go? At best, it can capture as if a reflection. But the reflection is a real reflection. It is not merely an image. It's not like a sketch you make of something. It is the light of that, and the light is substance of that as it settles on the mind. So you have the experience of the form, the image of the Supreme, as He shows Himself to our mentality. And this is as far as the mind is able to receive. Through this reflection, we know. But beyond this, the existing means of knowledge break down. And so the purpose of knowledge is accomplished. And then from then on, it is the continuing immersion in the experience itself. So we enter, for we find immortality, we enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. And at that point, something is happening where there is a double movement. And this is typical of many of the Upanishads, where they describe in two facets what is a single movement. Because as one ascends in the higher gradations of consciousness, things fuse in the mind. What you know and what you will are two separate functions taking place in two separate parts of our being. Therefore, it is difficult to will what you know, and there is always a conflict, a division. But in the supermind, the knowledge itself is. As we approach that higher consciousness, the two different workings tend to fuse. And if the Upanishad has to describe that working from the language of humanity, it has to look at both of these aspects. And both of them are presented as if two different aspects because we have a different vocabulary in the mind. And yet they're presented as complementing because they fuse to be one single movement as one ascends. And so you will recall in the Isha Upanishad, we saw repeatedly this movement. By the knowledge of unity, one attains to one goes beyond death. By the knowledge of by the knowledge of division, one goes beyond death. By the knowledge of unity, one attains. Both these are facets, aspects of a single consciousness, which appears this way and that way in two operations in the mind. In the same way here, in this verse, the two operations are presented as by the self one finds, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. And so Sri Aurobindo now comments on this double movement. He says, by self-realization of Brahman as our self, we find the force, the divine, which lifts us beyond the limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, all-pervading death and this is by the self. On the other side, by the knowledge of the one Brahman in all beings and in all the various movements of the cosmos, we attain beyond these things to the infinity. So on one side is the force that leads us beyond the limitations. On the other side is the knowledge which goes beyond these things to the actual infinity, the omnipotent being, the omniscient light, the pure beatitude of the divine existence. And so you're seeing two complementing sides. One frees you here, the other completes. But they're actually one single movement. In one, it is the aspect of the energy, the force. In the other, it is aspect of the knowledge. And now to fully appreciate what Sri Aurobindo has presented in his commentary, we have to go a little deeper into the actual Sanskrit words used and their nuances which come in the root sounds and the etymology. In the first line of the verse, which Sri Aurobindo translates as when it is known by the perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. This in the Sanskrit pratibodha viditam matam amritatvam hi vindate. So pratibodha, prati has this sense of the reflection as an imaging. Bodha is the understanding, or in this case, the perception. So the reflected perception, or the reflective perception, the perception which is an expression of a reflection. That's the sense of it. It is not our normal perception which is now reflecting. It is the power to know by reflection itself. Pratibodha viditam. When one knows by that power of reflection. Matam amritatvam hi vindate. Vindate, one finds, one acquires. Matam, in the thought, in the mind consciousness. Amritatvam. Not just amritam, but amritatvam. So amritatvam is the consciousness of immortality of the Satchidananda. But amritatvam, the tattvam here, is literally thatness, the substantiality of it, the thing itself, which is amritam. And so the suggestion here is, in this very knowing by the power of reflection, in the mind's consciousness, one is able as if to attain to the thing itself of the amritam. And one acquires, there is the sense of vindate, drawing in knowledge experience, acquisition, but in vindate, the vit is the root sound, vit is the knowledge experience into which one draws the whole thing. And so you see the formulation at the deeper level in Sanskrit is much more capturing of the sense of the experience as one enters by this power of knowing through reflection. When you translate into English, necessarily the words are much more flattened and mentalized, and one loses this intensity of the sense. And the second line, Atma vindate vidyata vidyaya vindate mritam. So Atma, again the vindate appears twice more. The same drawing in by the into knowledge experience, in a kind of an identification of knowing, which is the experience itself. So Atmana, by the self, you have this vindate, the drawing into knowledge experience, and the word used is viryam. Sri Aurobindo translates it as, by the self, one finds the force to attain. Viryam as the force to attain. If you go into the Sanskrit etymology and this related words with Viryam, you'll find Veera is the heroic or the hero, the virile, the powerful, the courageous, in particularly in action and in effort. But there is also another use of the word Viryam, which is in the yogic tradition, where it acquires the sense of the energy and power of this, the intensity by which one is able to overcome and to conquer. It is also the same term used associated with the power or energy which is gathered by the concentrated brahmacharya, celibacy in English, but it is much more than that. It is the gathering of the consciousness in dwelling on the Brahman. So celibacy is the English word, but the word in Sanskrit is brahmacharya. Is the Brahman here? Charya is the dwelling in, the feeding upon, or the nourishment from. Charati is the term used to describe the cow grazing. So literal translation would be the grazing upon Brahman. And if you observe what the cow does when it grazes, it very lightly takes the tip, nibbles upon the surface, the tips of the grass. And so it is the same sense of the consciousness dwelling upon the Brahman. It cannot eat the whole thing because that is infinite, but the dwelling upon and the nibbling upon what reaches to you, what you can reach out to and receive. And by the brahmacharya, the energy that is gathered and the intensification of the power which grows with it, and power, virility, is the sense of the virya. And so in this context, if you dwell on this idea, by the self one finds the force to attain, or in Atmana vindate virya. Remember, the vindate is the knowledge experience as you acquire it. And by the self-dwelling, you draw upon this nourishing energy which increases within you the heroic power to complete, to attain, to realize. And now we read what Sri Aurobindo says. By self-realization of Brahman as our self, we find the force, the divine energy which lifts us beyond the limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, all pervading death of our mortal existence. And you can see how what he's saying is conveying something so profound. If we relate it to our personal experience in life generally, and especially, particularly in the life of the yoga, you will find that in the normal journey of life, there are times when you are faced with a challenge where you have to overcome yourself, overcome circumstances. Always the overcoming requires an energy. The energy itself is guided by the knowledge and is able then to actualize the will. So here is a massive challenge before you, and you can say, well, this is too much, I'm tired, unable to fight, and I let go. Even though in my mind I know it is a fight which I have to face and I have to overcome, but not now, I am too tired. On the other hand, when the energy is full, then the knowledge can be activated, actualized, and the will can flow almost effortlessly. How can this be? And immediately the whole being turns to face the challenge and to overcome. This energy, which allows us to turn knowledge and will into an actual conquering power, that is the viryam, the force, the divine energy, which Sri Aurobindo is describing here. In the yoga, It is exactly this force which makes us able to make the effort. When, let's say, you have to now overcome an internal struggle, a part of your consciousness which hesitates or which resists, and something within you has now to say, all right, now I choose to change, to overcome. It need not always be in a head-on collision, but simply to assert what is known in the higher consciousness. Well, in that higher consciousness where you know there has to be this power and energy which can actualize and make effective what it knows to overcome. This is the virya. In the spiritual journey, one gathers as if this power over time by sustained concentration, by dwelling upon the divine, until by the very fact of being in touch with the vividness, the reality of the divine presence, one is infused with his energy. And that's why he says the divine energy, the force. And when one is full of that, full of the viryam, then overcoming one's limitations becomes almost effortless. On the other hand, if that energy is spilt or depleted or wasted in gossip or other dispersive activities, you find yourself without that high grade of energy. And now I know, but I cannot exercise what I know. That gap forms. And so here is a very profound principle, experience that is being alluded to. But in the context of the dwelling on Brahman, by the mind so opened in this power of knowledge by reflection. Atmana vindate viryam, by the self one finds the force to attain. And parallelly now, as if another aspect of the same principle comes, and by the knowledge one finds immortality. Vidyaya vindate amritam. The amritam, the Satchidananda, the consciousness of immortality, that is acquired similarly. Vindate, remember, is the knowledge experience in which you become what you know by vidya. Now, vidya is the knowledge of that higher, the higher knowledge, not the mental knowledge, but the higher experiential knowledge. So the knowledge you grow into and become one with the immortality, by the self dwelling upon that, knowing oneself to be that, one finds the force to attain. And you can see how these are the two facets, aspects of the knowledge will, which fuse into the supramental consciousness. And of this second side, Sri Aurobindo says, by the knowledge of the one Brahman in all beings and in all the various movements of the cosmos, we attain beyond these things, that is, beyond the beings and the movements, beyond these things to the infinity, the omnipotent being, the omniscient light, the pure beatitude of that divine existence. In the etymology, again, we dwell upon this. You see, he has used the word in the Kena. There is the Vindate, there is the Vidya, there is the Viryam, and Viditam. All of them have V. 4, 5, 6. 6 times the V appears. And if you go to the etymology of the term V, in the common usage when we speak of any word and you put the V in front, we would say Visheshena, that is by highlighting, by giving greater importance to. Whatever the term is, you put the V, it means in a special way, by greater emphasis upon. If you go into the etymology of it, you will see the V in all these terms relating to knowledge, but also the same term, the same root you will find becomes Vidyut for electricity. And the common stream in all these, in the etymology with the V, is the sense of the brightening, the intensifying of the light. What is knowledge? What happens when you know something? And if you go into the experience of knowledge, it is always a sense of something brightening, lighting up to reveal, and you know. When you have, for example, a problem for which you don't have a solution, you dwell upon it, and then suddenly there is this flash of insight. And we use the word flash. But what is happening within the experience of your consciousness, it's as if the problem, which was like a bundle, a knot, a jam, blocking, darkness, unable to see through, suddenly it reveals as if a light shines through and makes transparent, and you see the core, the knot of the problem, or the relationships in which the resolution is obvious. The hidden harmony is revealed. That light emerging, that light revealing is the experience of knowledge. There is no other sense of knowledge. In the experience of knowledge in which you grow in identification, it is your consciousness which is filled with the light that reveals the very substantiality of that which you know. You become what you know, and it grows in illumination. So the V as a prefix is used literally in the same sense as the English word highlight. What does it mean when you highlight something? Well, you put higher light, greater light, intensify the brightness of the awareness of it. How do you make something prominent? Make it brighter in your awareness, in your attention. And it's exactly the same sense which is conveyed in the V. And so the knowledge, by the knowledge we find immortality. And if you look at the sense of the V, it is the growing in the light and the substantiality of the light. The Chidananda is itself the substance of immortality and illumination of its own light. The force to attain the virya is also in the same direction, an intensity which illumines and reveals in the attainment. And when you dwell upon it in this sense, you realize that all of the higher experiences really are nothing but an emergence into light. But the nature of the light and the substantiality of the light are of a different order. And so when you reread what Sri Aurobindo describes here, and the meaning of the sense of reflection, now you can feel in a much more profound way. The mind can only reflect in a sort of supreme understanding and experience the form, the image of the Supreme as He shows Himself to our mentality. Now when you read this, suddenly you understand it more deeply. What is this reflecting? What is this image? What is this showing Himself? It is nothing but the Supreme light, the light of the Supreme which begins to fill, dawning, awakening in us. Through this reflection we find, we know. So we may even say, without the light, we cannot know. The light is the knowing, the knowledge. The purpose of knowledge is accomplished, for we find immortality. Except now it is the light of immortality and the substance of immortality. And so we enter into the law, the being, the beatitude of the Brahman consciousness. By self-realization of Brahman as ourself, we find the force, virya, the divine energy. And what does that do as that grows in us? Which lifts us beyond the limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, all-pervading death of our mortal existence. Now you see all that is described below, from which we are lifted. Limitation, weakness, darkness, sorrow, death. In your imaging of the mind, you associate with dullness, darkness, heaviness, inertia, tamas, which literally means darkness. And that is self limitation. And so, as the light fills, it frees you from all these. You are lifted into the light. And then, by the knowledge of the one Brahman in all beings and in all the various movements of the cosmos. And so, you look upon the whole cosmos, all the movements, all the beings now being filled with this revealing light. And what do you see in the light? You see beyond the appearance, beyond the forms, to the thing behind, which is the source of the light, which fills them with its light. We attain beyond these things to the infinity, the omnipotent being, the omniscient light, the pure beatitude of that divine existence. You can see how far we have come in our and understanding of this experience. From what we began originally by a sort of a mentalizing, you think upon, dwell upon the Brahman in your thought, and then like something touches, etc., something captures by reflection. But it goes far beyond that when you go deep into the sense of it. It is literally by the dwelling you are pulled into the experience itself. And the whole thing begins to fill with the light of Brahman, which reveals more and more his body, the body of the divine, in and through all things. You notice in all this experience, you have not moved from where you are. Physically and in time, you are located exactly where you are. In the body, in the human consciousness, through the human senses, but now opening to something which is the divine consciousness and the divine senses. And so, right here in life, you begin to perceive and experience the Amritam, the immortality. And the next verse, verse 5, which says, if here one comes to that knowledge, iha, right here, one comes to that knowledge, then one truly is. If here one comes not to the knowledge, then great is the perdition. The perdition here, Sri Aurobindo translates, vinashti. Vinashti. Nashti is destroying, breaking apart, falling apart. Vinashti, V with the highlighting, intensifying the falling apart, giving it a special extreme. That is the perdition, meaning what you lose is irrecoverable if you do not come to this knowledge here. You can come to this knowledge there, but what you lose, which is irrecoverable, is the form and body of Brahman who manifests in the universe. Because you know only his essence, but not his form. And there is no way there which will compel you back into form. But if you come to it here, then truly you know, because you know both the essence and the form of Brahman. And then the second line, the wise distinguish that in all kinds of becomings, that is in all the becomings in the movement of the cosmos, the wise distinguish that which fills, which leads, which is master of all the becomings. And they pass forward from this world and become immortal. Remember, the worlds are states of consciousness. From this state of consciousness, that is in which we live, divided, incapable, in death, we rise and pass into the consciousness of the immortality, Amritam. Sri Aurobindo now comments on this last verse. This great achievement must be done here, in this mortal world, in this limited body. For if we do, we arrive at our true existence and are no longer bound down to our phenomenal becoming. So, the question may be asked, if that is what we have to realize here, well, why did we come here? We could have stayed there where our soul always was, in that beatitude, knowing it anyway. But precisely in there, you know only that aspect, that side of the one. You do not know this side, which is his body, his form, his manifestation. And so to know that, we enter into this extreme. And in order to know that fully, we choose to experience the extreme from his extreme, which is complete self-loss into inconscience. That is also him choosing to enter inconscience. And so to know him, we as conscious souls have entered that experience of the other extreme of not knowing him, or rather knowing him in his self-denial. And then from there recovering bit by bit, layer by layer, all of his possibilities, innumerable facets of his manifestation. And in the journey, there is also the delight of discovery of him as much as of discovery of oneself. And that is where the play and the delight of discovery unfolds. But the goal then being to realize him in his totality. Here, as we emerge into form, we know his highest to his lowest. And then we arrive at our true existence and are no longer bound to our phenomenal becoming. As long as we don't know him, we are bound in this. We think this is all we are. But when we know him in his totality, we know our freedom while also knowing the forms in which we play out our freedom. But if here we find it not, great is the loss and perdition, for we remain continually immersed in the phenomenal life of the mind and body and do not rise above it into the true supramental existence. So if we don't find it here in this journey, we remain bound in the ignorance. Nor if we miss it here, will death give it to us by our passage to another and less difficult world. So the sense of the loss is on two levels. Both here, you have remained bound in ignorance, but on the other side, if you were to get across to another less difficult world, there also you would not get it. Only those who use their awakened self and enlightened powers to distinguish and discover that one and immortal in all existences, the all-originating self, the all-inhabiting Lord, can make the real passage which transcends life and death. So in the transition after death, we do not gain to it also, because where are you finally? You'll see how this current discussion is mirroring very closely our current discussions also in the Friday study of the synthesis of yoga, where also he makes this comment in the session we had 2 days ago, that merely shedding the body does not give us that, because we were never body. We were consciousness inhabiting the body. You remove the body, we are still the consciousness that we were. So the passage beyond after shedding the body still does not give us that. How do you get to that? The only way. Only those who use their awakened self and enlightened powers to distinguish and discover that one and when we dwell on ourselves, observe our consciousness, our motivations, our drives in life, we realize we live or we have not one but several selves. Sri Aurobindo even uses this to define the word soul. In the English language, the word soul is used very loosely and has multiple meanings. So Sri Aurobindo qualifies the word soul in 3 different ways. There is the outer desire soul, that is I, who define myself by my wants, my likes, my desires, my needs, and I am made only of that. As an exercise, ask somebody to introduce themselves. I wish to know you better. Can you tell me more about you? And you notice the narration will be, I like these things, I don't like those things, I do those things, I don't do those things. The lives of your desires and the bundle which they form is what we identify ourselves with. And this is the desire soul. Behind that, deeper within, Sri Aurobindo calls the inner soul. And the part which is common to all of us is when we go deep in ourselves, freeing ourselves from our desires, and look at what are our deeper and higher motivations. And we're all seeking good, happiness, love, well-being, etc., harmony. And then that's all we can go to in our self-awareness. Behind these two is the inmost or true soul, the psychic being, the one who takes the birth and carries the essence of our evolution across lives, of which we are not conscious even in our deepest. It's a very common error, even in the practice of the yoga, to confuse this inner soul with the inmost soul. All that sweet, loving, gentle, harmonious, sensitive part of my deepest. People say, that is my psychic. No, it's not. That is at best a reflection of the psychic. So we realize we have a self, which is the confused, sleeping, mechanical, desire-driven, somnambulist self. It is as if half asleep. From morning to evening, if you observe all your activities, your thoughts, emotions, actions, they were entirely mechanical, driven in reaction to circumstances. In rare moments when something goes wrong, you wake up and review and then fall back into the mechanical sleep. So you're about to lift a glass of water, thinking it is full, but actually it's empty, and suddenly your hand goes up. And there's a moment of shock. Oh, it's empty. And a brief confusion, and then a decision to fill it, and then you fall back into the mechanical movement. You're not conscious of the rest, at least not intentionally. Your mind is drifting in some thoughts. Again, those are mechanically, habitually driven by association. So we are actually living most of the time in a kind of a sleepy sense of self, even in our most awakened normal state. There is, in contrast to that, an awakened self, closer to the inner or some higher poise of consciousness, where we step back and ask, why? Why am I doing this? What do I really want? What is this life about? And often this comes in a state of shock, but otherwise by conscious dwelling. But the poise which sees this and questions looks at something larger. After doing all this, after repeating every day the same cycle, where is it going? Do I just want to continue this mechanically, or is there something deeper, more meaningful that I want to do? And this perception itself is a higher, awakened quality of consciousness. It naturally sees a larger picture, naturally looks at deeper meanings, deeper sense values, because it corresponds to a deeper part of our own consciousness. Often something of the inner or a reflection in the mind of the inner or inmost. So this is the awakened self. However awakened partially it may be. But it is awakened because it can see deeper and seek something more essential. And second, he uses the word enlightened powers to distinguish and discover that one. And enlightened powers, again, if you look at the normal working of your mind, it is primarily driven to senses. Everything you're thinking of has to do with objects, forms, arrangements, and sequences of arrangements. You have a power to look behind. Why does this happen? And this is where science begins. Science itself, the word science meaning knowledge. nations non-consciousness and science is consciousness. You become more conscious of the things behind which drive. Why are people doing this? Why am I behaving this way? And this enlightened power can go deeper layer by layer. You realize when you observe in this way that almost everything is happening within me mechanically, and there are very few things where I'm able to act consciously. My awakened self can exercise its power. And you apply this to the causes of things. What do I really want? And with the enlightened power, look at the deeper meaning and what brings deeper meaning. So these are the two things we have. Only those who use their awakened self and enlightened powers. And what can they do when they act at their deepest? To distinguish and discover that one and immortal in all existences. When you, in this way, dwell, and at first perhaps in an activity of mind, you ask, why are you doing this? Why are people running around trying to make money? Because through that money they will exercise a greater freedom and have perhaps some greater comforts and happinesses. Okay, so why do you want the freedom and the ability to exercise your freedom and happiness? Behind it, there is one more layer. Why do you want that? And you look deeply. Eventually you come to something common. Everybody in the world is seeking for deep satisfaction, not shallow, temporary, but lasting, permanent satisfaction, lasting, permanent happiness, lasting, permanent love, lasting, permanent unity, harmony. These are all the fundamental drives in all beings, including the most unconscious creatures, plants, and animals. And you see this. In your mind's awareness, you recognize they are seeking because something inside is inhabiting that is immortal. It prods, it goads things to move, to seek that, to realize that in life. That is the first drive in all things, in all beings. And so we begin to dwell upon in this way and begin to see everywhere the one, the immortal in all existences. So he's putting two words, one and immortal. And these are two different facets of the perception. One sees the divine presence which is immortal in all things, even in objects. When a form is born, let's say biologically, a child is born, there is the immortal presence which revealed itself through that form. What happens when the form breaks down? The immortal presence doesn't break down, it persists, it continues, perhaps form to form or layers of forms, subtler forms. Even in physical objects, when you create in clay a form, a toy, something fills which is immortal. You break the clay form, that immortality does not go away, it exists. In my mind, I have the memory of that object which was destroyed when I was a child, but it exists, it is real still. So the sense of the underlying immortality and the immortal presence in all existence is the common oneness, capital One. That it is the same one who is in all things, supporting all things. These are two different sides of the perception. Each leads to the other. And then the all originating self, the all inhabiting Lord. These are two more on which we can dwell. What is it that is the beginning of all these things? What makes their existence possible? And so this is one of the great Upanishads where the young student is told by the teacher, the Rishi, go and dwell upon that which is the origin of all things, which sustains all things, and into which all things disappear. That is the Brahman. So the young disciple goes and dwells upon it, and after deep introspection, he comes to the knowledge Remember, it is the knowledge which is experience. He sees, he knows, he becomes one with that knowledge. He comes and says, matter. Not forms of things, not names of things, not colors, not properties. Matter as an essential underlying reality. Matter is Brahman. And the Rishi does not say wrong. He says right. Now go and go deeper. And he comes back and realizes with a new insight that what sustains matter is energy. And he comes back and says, Pranam Brahman. You see, the whole thing is much deeper when you look at it in Sanskrit. First he says, Annam Brahman. And Annam is not matter, it is food. Matter as food, because everything is eating everything else and is being eaten while it eats. That's the nature of this material existence. But behind that is the energy which drives all this working. And so he says Pranam Brahman, and then Mana Brahman, and two more layers beyond. And it is only when he comes to that that he knows Brahman in his fullness. But you can dwell upon this idea, the all-originating self, which is the third thing to dwell upon. And the fourth, the all-inhabiting Lord, the one divine presence who is in all things, who enjoys himself in all things. So, rereading the sentence, only those who use their awakened self and enlightened powers to distinguish and discover the one, that one and immortal in all existences, the all-originating self, the all-inhabiting Lord, can make the real passage which transcends life and death, can pass out of this mortal status, can press beyond and rise upwards into a world transcending immortality. So it is by dwelling on this and by the revelation of that divine presence in all things, behind all things, and above, that one has this true liberation from both life and death, and therefore the immortality which is there in all things. Sri Aurobindo now concludes the whole discussion of this chapter. This then, and no other, is the means to be seized on and the goal to be reached. There's no other way to attain to the immortality except this, by the dwelling upon the one, immortal, all-originating, all-inhabiting divine. This then and no other is the means to be seized on. Not only is the means, it is also the goal. The means itself is the goal, and therefore in the journey each step is nothing but a growing immersion in the goal. And then he puts in quote marks, there is no the Bhagavad Gita and in the Veda. In the Veda, it says, in knowing the Brahman is the only way, the only path. The Gita similarly says that it is only by the dwelling on the divine that you attain to the liberation. And so there is no other path for the great journey. The self and the Lord are that indeterminable, unknowable, ineffable, Para Brahman, supreme, divine. And when we seek rather that which is indeterminable and unknowable to us, it is still the self and the Lord always that we find. Though by an attempt which is not the straight and possible road intended for the embodied soul seeking here to accomplish its true existence. Now comes a very important idea, and it corrects for the error of the ascetic path, which seeks to know that indeterminable and unknowable directly, bypassing this intermediate passage of knowing the self and the Lord. So remember the path marked out by the Kena Upanishad, to dwell upon that of the Lord which is yourself and that of the Lord which is in the working of the gods. So it is by the dwelling in the self and the presence of the Lord in the working of the cosmos. These are the two ways. Because in these two ways, through form, we pass to that which is beyond form and which is the same one, divine. But it's possible to say, knock out all this, go straight to that. And Sri Aurobindo points out, even when you go straight to that, you know that only through the self, or you know it as the self and the Lord. But by an attempt which is not the straight path, and the road intended for the embodied soul seeking here to accomplish its true existence. That path will not allow you to accomplish here. It will get you out of the game, get you out of the system, not bring the divine into the fulfillment in the manifestation. So it is not the road intended for the embodied soul seeking here to accomplish its true existence. We came here to accomplish our true existence, which was there, to accomplish it here. If the goal is to accomplish here, then that path to go bypassing the passage of the divine in the manifestation, that is not right. It would be an error. And this is the reason why you will find also in life, very few are really satisfied by an abandonment and withdrawal of life. There is the very strong corrective power of life which brings us back to say, no, but this has something special which I must realize. It's not an escape. Mother speaks deprecatingly of this approach. She says it is a shrinking, it is an escape, it is a cowardly approach to abandon life and say it is intractable, it cannot be divinized, and I want to escape and get out of it. There are very few souls who are destined for that. Otherwise, for us, it is a cowardly poise. Rather, the approach should be to realize here, to find the deeper truth and manifest it, to conquer and achieve and manifest. So he concludes the chapter. They, that is the self and the Lord, they are the self-manifested reality which so places itself before man as the object of his highest aspiration and the fulfillment of all his activities. So the object of our highest aspiration is in the knowledge of the self, in the experience of the self, and the fulfillment of all our activities is in the realization of the Lord in all activities. And so this completes the chapter which dwells on part 2 of the Kena. And the next chapter takes up the Kena, part 3, which is quite unusual. If you were to read it on your own, you find there a story, a parable of the gods. And the gods who are thrown a challenge and they are unable to achieve that which they are given as a challenge. And the whole meaning of that and what it represents for what we have just discussed is in the next chapter. Sri Aurobindo calls it, chapter 13, the parable of the gods. And what the Kena is teaching us through this parable is the means by which we are to make this bridge. To attain, not just to know and dwell in the divine consciousness, but to have that manifesting in us. That the mind and act in the world. The divine sense may fill our senses. The divine life may fill our life. And the divine creative word, speech, may animate our actions in the world. How are we to make this bridge? And by what means are they to act in us? This is the problem and the solution which the Kena deals with in the next 2 chapters, which we will be taking up from next Sunday. For now, we can dwell upon what we have read and meditate on its deeper significance. When in the verse 4 it says, when it is known by perception that reflects it, then one has the thought of it, for one finds immortality. By the self, one finds the force to attain, and by the knowledge, one finds immortality. Atmana vindate vidyaya vindate Amritam.